Hi everybody, I know it's been a long time since the last video, but here we are again in lockdown part 3. So I've decided that I'm going to continue doing these, and we're going to start by having a look at the remainder of the poems that we still have to cover. There's 8 of the poems that I covered in the first lockdown, so there's videos for each of those, and now we have the remaining 7 to have a look at. So today we're going to start with Winter Swans by Owen Shears, which is one of the more modern poems in the collection. It's actually one of the ones where the imagery and things are quite easy to get your head around, and the language is quite easy, so it's quite a nice one to start with to get back into this. So I hope this video is really, really useful. As always, we're going to use the 5-step process looking at the poems, looking at midsole. So we'll be looking at meaning, imagery, tone, structure, and language within the poem Winter Swans. I hope this is really useful for you. Okay, so the first thing we have to do is to read the poem and get our head around what exactly is going on before we get into the deeper meaning, structure, imagery within the poem. So, Winter Swans by Owen Shears. The clouds had given their all, 2 days of rain and then a break in which we walked, the waterlogged earth gulping for breath at our feet as we skirted the lake silent and apart, until the swans came and stopped us with a show of tipping in unison, as if rolling their weights down their bodies to their heads. They halved themselves in the dark water, icebergs of white feather, paused before returning again, like boats righting in rough weather. They'd mate for life, you said as they left, porcelain over the stilling water. I didn't reply, but as we moved on through the afternoon light, slow stepping in the lake's shingle and sand, I noticed our hands that had somehow swum the distance between us, and folded one over the other like a pair of wings settling after flight. Okay, so as I mentioned at the start of this video, this poem isn't one that has lots of tricky imagery and tricky metaphors to consider. It's quite literal in its interpretation. The poem's called Winter Swans, and the actual meaning of the poem is a couple who encounter a pair of swans on a walk on a winter's morning. Now, what we have is the significance behind that and what the meaning of the poem is. The couple are in a difficult position in their relationship, and they feel very isolated, and they feel very apart from one another, and they skirt the lake silent and apart. So we've got to imagine this couple walking beside the lake apart from each other, not connecting and not making that emotional connection within their relationship. Now, when they see the swans, one member, the narrator's partner, comments that swans mate for life, and then suddenly there's a reconciliation between the couple, and their hands swim together and join together, and they end up holding hands. So the meaning of the poem is looking at this idea of distance and separation, but then reconciliation within a relationship, bringing it all back together, making sure that the relationship succeeds, and forgiveness and all that sort of idea of rejoining and bringing the couple back together. Now, this poem compares really, really nicely with Neutral Tones, which is one that we covered in the first lockdown period. There's a video out there for that, looking at a similar sort of situation where the poet remembers going for a walk on a winter's day and the decay and the death of the world, which sort of signified the end of their relationship. Whereas in contrast, this poem has the two swans uniting the couple and bringing them back together again. So we have a poem that is about that breaking of a relationship, but then the bringing it back together again, and the reunification by the end of the poem. Okay, so probably the most important techniques that we're going to consider here is the imagery within the poem. The use of simile, the use of metaphor, and particularly the use of the images that the poet creates and crafts within this poem are the strongest technique, I would argue, within Winter Swans. So across the poem there are lots of different references to the swans themselves, but also to the environment of the world around this couple and how that they're responding to that. So for example, in the first stanza, we have the clouds had given their all, 2 days of rain and then a break in which we walked, the waterlogged earth at the start of stanza 2. Now, this is a really interesting one because we have the enjambment from running from stanza 1 to stanza 2, but also the imagery of the waterlogged earth gulping for breath at our feet. So we've got to imagine this is like a mud that's been saturated with water and it's making that gulping sound. But also it could signify the relationship, that it's gasping for breath, that it's the end of this relationship, or it feels like it's gasping for breath. So that's a really nice image that you might want to consider. Now in stanza 3 we have "Until the swans came and stopped us," with a show of tipping in unison as if rolling weights down their bodies to their heads. So we have this idea of the swans moving across the lake and then in sync tipping and diving for food. And it looks as if it's a graceful movement, and the idea of it being in unison and the idea about it being together is quite significant, because then what we have is an image of the separation of the couple, but also the uniting nature of these two swans in this stanza. In stanza 4 we have "They halve themselves in dark water, icebergs of white feather, pause before returning again, like boats righting in rough weather." So we have the idea of the birds offering some sense of stability, like a rowing boat that's tipping in the wind, but then ultimately it manages to find its balance, it manages to find the stability that this relationship is offering. The idea of an iceberg as well, obviously iceberg where there's lots more beneath the surface, and it's made of ice, it's pure and it's white. There's lots of imagery that we can associate with that and how the swans are being presented in that particular image. In stanza 5 we have "They mate for life," they said, you said as they left, "porcelain over the stilling water," as we moved on through the afternoon light. Now the use of porcelain could be quite significant because that's like china, so it's fragile, it's very delicate, to suggest potentially the relationship between the two characters in the poem is quite fragile and quite delicate. But the water is starting to still, it's starting to calm down, so we can see the friction and the pressures of the relationship are actually starting to come back together. So finally, towards the end of the poem, in stanza 6 and into the final couplet in stanza 7, we have the hands swimming the distance between them and then folding together like a pair of wings settling after flight. So the imagery here is that the hands are moving almost like birds' wings, and when they settle together, it's like a pair of wings folded over one another. So the image of the swans is being reflected in the image of the couple. So lots of really nice and interesting imagery we can look at here, and a lot we can take in different directions for multiple different interpretations. The tone of Winter Swans is actually quite interesting because we go from a change and a transition from one state of the narrator to another. Unlike a poem like Neutral Tones, which is cyclical in its nature and it returns back and back to the despair at the end of the relationship, Winter Swans is very different in the sense that it goes from a sense of despair and separation and isolation to a sense of reconciliation and a hope towards the end of the poem. So actually there's a shift in the tone of the poem from one state to another. So if we look at language from the start of the poem, we could consider things like the waterlogged earth gulping for breath beneath our feet. The idea of him being silent and apart, the use of those adjectives is really, really interesting there. We've got the idea of the fact that they skirted the lake as if it's they're not really getting to the deep issues that they need to solve their relationship. Given they're all 2 days of rain and then a break in which we walked, so it feels like this is an opportunity to maybe reconcile the relationship. Then once we get to stanza 3, we have a really interesting idea of the enjambment between stanza 2 and stanza 3, where you've got "Until the swans came and stopped us." There's this shift, there's this change in perception, and when they consider the relationship of the swans, it forces a change in their relationship. Now, we have in the final stanzas 6 and 7, we have the hands that had somehow swum the distance between us. So the distance is narrowing at the end of the poem. The relationship is starting to repair itself, and then they fold over one another like a pair of wings settling after flight. The fact that the poet chooses to end with settling implies that there's a change and that there's a relaxation, and the poem is actually the poet has actually come to a more hopeful part of their relationship. Now, if you want to talk about the structure of the poem, we could link into what we've just been talking about with tone, the fact that we have a transition from one state to another, and structurally there is a change in the way that the poet is speaking and the poet's attitude across the poem. If we want to get even cleverer, we can have a look at the way that the poem is laid out. So the first 6 stanzas have 3 lines within them, which is an unusual poetic form. Usually poems are paired in couplets or occasionally in groups of 4. Now, by putting it in groups of 3, it looks unusual, and that actually means that it's a little bit unbalanced. The poem is not quite right. So we have initial stanzas where you're looking at 3 lines, it makes it seem unbalanced and makes it seem that the relationship isn't quite perfect. Now, by the time we get to the end of the poem, we have a couplet, we have a pair of lines together. Now, what that's maybe inferring or potentially looking at is the idea that the reconciliation is now perfect, that things have started to come back together and things are starting to repair themselves. Structurally, we also have an interesting idea of the fact that it's a first-person narrative voice, and we have this unnamed narrator talking about it, and we have some forms of direct speech within there. And the only bit of direct speech that we have is "they mate for life," which is ultimately the message of the poem to bring it back towards its reconciliation. So really interesting points that we could make structurally, and considering that we had look at things like setting, looking at winter, and the idea that the winter is a time of decay, a time of potentially the death of the natural world, and ending on a significance of hope could be a really interesting structural point that we might want to consider a little bit further. Okay, as we've already talked about with imagery, there is a lot of language features to do with comparison, to do with metaphor, and to do with simile within this poem. So, for example, things like the waterlogged earth gulping for breath at our feet. The use of personification here is quite an interesting idea, and the earth actually gasping for breath, much like the partner's relationship. We could also have a look at this idea of the extended metaphor of the swans being symbolic of their relationship. The reconciliation and the peace of, and the harmony of bringing the couple back together. We could look at things like the use of the imagery of icebergs, so the metaphor of icebergs, or we could say the simile of like boats writing in rough weather. All of this really interesting imagery is good to consider when we look at language. We could also look at things like enjambment and how the poet's quite clever in his use of enjambment. We have between stanza 1 and stanza 2, we have in which we walked, and then the break, the waterlogged earth gulping for breath at our feet. Now that's quite interesting because it creates that unease, that sense of separation. We have things like, as we skirted the lake silent and apart at the end of stanza 2, and then the third stanza starts with until the swans came and stopped us. So that enjambment is quite interesting because we could break that apart and look at how this is certainly a turning point in the poet's relationship at the start of stanza 3. We might want to look at the idea of the first person narrative, the fact that it's I and then the collective pronoun we is quite significant because it gives it a more personal perspective and it gives it a much more emotive feel within the poem, looking at the poet's own relationship, and it's very reflective in that. We might want to look at things like the use of sibilance, the use of alliteration. So the idea of softness and the use of S sound is particularly in stanza 6 when the poem's starting to reconcile and start to come back together. We have slow stepping in the shingle and sand. That repeated S sound is creating a soft sound rather than the much harsher relationship that they potentially had at the start of the poem. We could look at things like onomatopoeia, like gulping for breath is quite an interesting use of the word there. There's lots and lots of really, really interesting use of language here to do with the change in the relationship. In the first few stanzas, the semantic field of darkness and death is quite significant, looking at clouds, rain, waterlogged, gulping, breath, silent. Whereas later on in the poem, when we look at the swans, we've got a semantic field to do with grace and to do with dignity, icebergs, paused, writing, porcelain, stilling, all the sorts of vocabulary that the poet is using very cleverly to create this contrast within the poem. So plenty to get your head around with language, plenty to look at, certainly for techniques wise, but if it was me personally, I would be looking at imagery, looking at similes and metaphors, looking at alliteration, and looking at enjambment are the particular ones that I would consider. Okay, for you to do with this poem, I would like you to consider the Mitchell grid, or to make your own notes on those 5 areas, looking at meaning, imagery, tone, structure, and language. If you want to be taking this a step further, we are going to look at some comparisons later on in this half term. But if you want to start to look at some comparisons, potentially have a look at doing a grid comparing the presentation of a relationship between this poem and neutral tones, as that is a natural comparison that fits really, really well. Obviously, if there's any comments you'd like to make, obviously just put them underneath the video. But until next time, we're going to be having a look at, I think, Love's Philosophy in the next video. I hope this has been really useful, and see you for the next one.